Hi guys, it's Caroline, and today I'm going to be going through the best book that I read each month because it's only fair since I did the worst book. Okay, getting right into it is January, and that is Thunderhead by Neal Shusterman. Now, I read the entire trilogy this year, all in January, and I really loved it. I think this book is my favorite because I think Thunderhead, a lot of people didn't like it, but I didn't mind it, but it just is so radically different from what the other ones are, so I just think that this is where the book hit its stride. We really get into the Thunderhead's thoughts, even though it's an AI, and I think that this is where the world building really took off, but we were already familiar with the characters, so I really cared about them. Also, in the first book, it kind of tried to do this romance thing, and it was less prevalent in this particular one. If you don't know, The Toll and Scythe and Thunderhead is a trilogy about a world where no one can ever die, and so there are certain people called scythes whose job it is to go around and kill people when it's like their time or whatever. And these two kids are training to become a scythe, and there's a whole bunch of shenanigans. You can see that there's an ethical dilemma here. I think that this was really well done, and it was my favorite of the trilogy. Next up is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I don't have a physical copy because I'm lending it to my grandma because I got her all up in that Toni Morrison life. I love Toni Morrison. I wrote my junior paper on Paradise and Beloved and intersectionality in feminism. I absolutely love her writing, the magical realism, and all of that. Each of her books kind of deals with something different, but The Bluest Eye is about the way that children, particularly Black girls, who constantly are consuming media and propaganda that shows like white girls, white bodies, white people, and sort of puts those roles on these young girls. And so as a Black girl, seeing all these like Barbies and stuff with blonde hair and blue eyes and how detrimental that is to growing up, which it's already hard enough to be a girl growing up. There's also a lot of harder themes, and it's kind of a tough read, but it is so worth it. In March, my favorite book was Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. This is a book about performative activism. A Black girl who is a nanny, she's like 20-something years old, she's out with her friends, and someone throws a rock through the window of the family that she nannies for, and so they call her up. They say, hey, can you take the little girl while we deal with this and call the police? Amira takes this little girl to the grocery store, and this whole thing happens where someone thinks that she's trying to kidnap her because Amira is wearing like going out clothes, and she's got this young white child in the supermarket, even though they're not doing anything wrong. And so all this stuff starts to unravel. The performative activism of the parents, who like to think of themselves as really like open-minded, and sort of how they deal with this like scenario, which is like not good, not a good time. It's fairly didactic and like kind of goes hard, but it's just so easy to get behind, and it's such an interesting and like fun contemporary. It's funny at times, but it really points out the microaggressions that take place even when someone considers themselves an ally. April, my favorite book, was Station 11. I've talked about this book a bunch on my channel because I really do love it, and I think I read it at the exact right time. April was when the pandemic had started, but we'd kind of gotten over the initial shock. It was what it was, and we were in like really strict quarantine, and it's a book about a pandemic, and like a really serious pandemic where people are essentially just nomadic and there's not many people left. And I think that it actually gave me a lot of hope for the human condition. We're gonna make it out. First of all, our pandemic's not as bad as all of this, but also that like even if things turn out to be really bad, the human spirit like finds ways to go on. And I think it gave me a lot of hope in a time that I was really struggling and not having a good time and like stuck by myself because of a pandemic. So I think it's a great book for any time, but it also like hit my hands at the exact right time. So in May, my favorite book was Cloud Atlas. Now, we read that for my book club, and I really enjoyed it. It's set up, it's 5 different stories that are almost like Russian nesting dolls. So you read a snippet of one, and you don't see that until the very end. And then there's one all the way at the center. And what's beautiful about that book is that each snippet, they're kind of loosely intertwined, but not really. And each one is like from a completely different genre. So the first one is sort of like an 1800s Victorian-esque novel. One of them is sort of like a 1950 detective, you know, reporter thing. One of them is like a super duper sci-fi. They're just all over the place, and David Mitchell really shows his range in that book by just, you know, doing it all. And Honestly, I'm glad that they don't come all together in some really gimmicky, like, look at how all the knots get tied way. I think it's actually really beautiful how these things thematically were intertwined. I know there's a movie, and the movie sounds absolutely terrible because I don't know how you could possibly put this into film in any way that made sense, but I kind of want to watch it and just see it in all its disastrous glory. In June, we have Girl, Woman, Other. It's only fitting that in June my least favorite book was The Testaments and my favorite book was Girl, Woman, Other. Basically, this is a chorus of voices, all of whom are Black women or at one point identified as Black women, and they come from all walks of life. Some are immigrants, some are many generations in the UK. You see perspectives from the mother, from the daughter, from the friends, just all sorts of people that are like loosely intertwined or very tightly intertwined. I think it's really well done and shows the like just absolute spectrum of different experiences that people can have while still identifying under the same like umbrella terms such as like Black or woman. And I think it just shows there's not one singular experience for any identity. It also shows like why certain people act in certain ways. So you might think, that's terrible parenting. Why would a mother act like that? When you're reading from the child's point of view and you totally understand her anger, and then from the parent's point of view, you'll read from the mother and you'll be like, oh my God, I can totally understand why you would treat your child that way because, you know, X, Y, and Z and how you grew up, this is how you see things. And it just shows you that like, there's not two sides to every story, but there's two sides to a lot of stories. And I just think it's well done. It's like kind of written strangely. There's not a lot of, there's no periods, which is weird. And so it almost kind of takes a somewhat poetic form. But I just thought my brain just gelled with that. I just felt like I was just getting this is what I want stream of consciousness to actually feel like in my brain. And it never does, but this did. So it's well written. Give it all the awards. July is the Southerners Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. I never get that name right. I think this is a book that is so much more than what it looks like on the surface. Yes, it's a paranormal novel set in the 90s. Yeah, that seems really gimmicky, but first of all, it's set very close to my hometown, and I think it does a really great job exploring gender roles as well as racism in the South, even as late as the 1990s. I think it uses the paranormal aspect to discuss some of these different important topics without shoving it down your throat. They're just kind of quietly there. It's funny, it's got a lot of heart, and it doesn't take itself seriously at all. The vampire bit is very played up. It's akin to a Scream movie, so you don't think that this person is like, you must believe in the vampires. And I think it was just like good, clean fun. And like the horror stuff, I mean, it's not like Mexican Gothic in the sense that you're really supposed to like buy into the whole shenanigans. Like you're supposed to be like kind of along for the fun ride. In August, my favorite book was The Final Empire. I read this entire trilogy. This was my first introduction to Brandon Sanderson. I loved the entire trilogy. I gave them all 4.5 or 5 stars, but this was my favorite just because it has that heist element that I just absolutely love to death. And I think that Brandon Sanderson does such an amazing job with world building. The end of this book in particular smacks you in the face, although all the books smack you in the face at the end. And I could not recommend this enough. I'm on such a Brandon Sanderson kick. I can see myself reading so many books this year. I just know it's going to happen. 2021 is going to be the year of the Sanderson because I read this series and I absolutely loved it. Next up is The Lying Life of Adults by Elena Ferrante. I just think that this is such a poignant book. I think it does its job. It really kind of toes the line between when you're a teenage girl and you see like grown men leering at you and like becoming interested in your body, that weird line where sometimes it makes you feel really adult to be a part of their world and to be looked at like that. And on the other hand, you don't know what you're doing and you realize it's kind of creepy and uncomfortable, and sort of trying to sort out like what male attention you actually like and what male attention is like inappropriate or you're just not interested in. It also deals with like family and realizing your parents aren't perfect, especially because when you're a child, a lot of times like all you do is look up to your parents and you realize they have their own complicated relationships with each other and with their families and with you. And I think that it was just really like written truly. October, my favorite book is The Shadow King. Now you can see that the Booker really hits sometimes because I have like a bunch of books that either won the Booker, like Cloud Atlas and Girl, Woman, Other, or were just like long or short listed this year. I think that this is a really well-written novel. It's about the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, particularly about the women's like role in it and how it's often overlooked. But it also is like from the perspective of this photographer with the Italians. He is Jewish and he is sort of being protected by the general because this is around the time of World War II and Jews are getting like rounded up. And so this photographer's parents are basically being taken to a concentration camp, and this terrible Italian general who's killing all these Ethiopians is absolutely ruthless, also has like a soft side and is protecting this Jewish photographer. Of course, this photographer himself is problematic because he's like taking photos of Ethiopians being tortured and like attacked and killed and murdered, and yet like you're also seeing him dealing with the fact that the Holocaust, like the beginnings of the Holocaust are happening, and he can see it happening from afar and there's nothing he can do to save his parents. I think it really shows the duality of history. I think it also points out the things that we have chosen to remember, such as the Holocaust, versus the things we have chosen not to remember or to forget or to just not care about, such as like the Italian-Ethiopian War, because I mean, I'd never heard about it in my history books when I was learning history, and we spent so long on like World War II and all of that, and we just like brush Africa and African history aside so often. I think this book was really well done. I will say the first 100 pages are really, really slow, so keep that in mind. I would say just push through because the final 300 pages is just like a whirlwind. Okay, in November is none other than The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I gave this 4.5 stars. I was really nervous at first because it was really hyped up, and the first little bit of it is slow and it feels a little bit overwritten to me, but once you get into the meat of it and you start falling in love with the characters, it was just, you know, game over. For me, I cared more about Luke and Henry. I didn't so much care about Addie, so the beginning was meh for me because of that, because it's mostly Addie. But once those two sort of become more prevalent, I think that it just becomes so much more interesting and like rich, and I actually really found the overwrittenness, like the quotability of this book, to be really endearing by the end, once I like actually deeply cared about the characters. The other thing is, I think some people think the ending's kind of gimmicky. I won't spoil it, but I actually really liked it and thought it was like touching and truthful and felt right for this book, particularly because this is a book about a girl who lives forever. So like, how are you going to end that? You know, it's like you have to find some point somewhere, and I think V.E. Schwab did a really great job finding that point without feeling like she just ripped it out from underneath of us. And finally, for December, my favorite book of December was These Violent Delights. This is a 1920 Shanghai retelling of Romeo and Juliet, and there is a pandemic that is supernatural in nature, so really there's a lot going on. I won't say too much about it because you can watch my wrap-up, which will be posted soon, but I really love this. I think that the characters were interesting. I think their relationships were dynamic, and it had really that yearning that comes with Romeo and Juliet without feeling like a straight regurgitation of the Shakespearean play, which I really appreciated and thought was well done, and I just think that she crushed this book. I can't believe I played myself because this is a duology. It like is a complete cliffhanger. It really goes through only half the play, and I read it like a month after it came out, and now I'm gonna have to wait God knows how long for the sequel. I play myself. This is why I binge series. But anyway, those are my favorite books from each month. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!